His name was Johann Winkler. And on the morning of January 30th, 1933, he was doing what he did every weekday morning, walking to work. He was a machinist at a metalworks factory on the eastern edge of Munich, 41 years old. A man who had spent 20 years operating the same kind of lathe in the same kind of building, producing the same kind of parts. His hands were permanently marked by the work, calloused in specific places, the fingernails never quite clean no matter how hard he scrubbed. He had fought in the First World War, came back in 1918 with a shrapnel scar on his left shoulder and a particular way of going quiet sometimes that his wife Margaret had learned over 15 years of marriage not to push against. That morning, the streets of Munich were louder than usual. Groups of men moving with purpose, flags that hadn't been there yesterday, a sound somewhere ahead, cheering, or something that wanted to be cheering. Johann walked past it the way he walked past most things. Head down, hands in pockets, getting where he needed to go. His foreman told him when he arrived at the factory. Hitler had been appointed chancellor. Germany had a new government. Johann said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded and went to his machine. That nod, that small, unremarkable nod, is where this story really begins. To understand what Johann Winkler's nod meant, you have to understand what his life had looked like for the previous decade. In 1923, the year of the Great Inflation, Johann had watched the money in his savings account become essentially worthless over the course of a few months. He had been saving for 5 years. He and Margaret were going to buy a small house, nothing grand, just something with a garden, something their daughter Hilda could grow up in with solid floors under her feet. The savings disappeared. Not stolen, just made meaningless by forces neither of them could name or understand. They stayed in their rented apartment. In 1929, when the global depression hit, the metalworks cut shifts. Johann went from 6 days a week to 4 days, then to 3. They ate less. Margaret took in sewing. Hilda, who was 12 that year, started lying about how much the school lunch cost so that her parents would give her less money and have more for themselves. They discovered this later. It broke Margaretta's heart in a particular way that she never fully described, but that Johann understood. By 1932, there were 6 million unemployed in Germany. Not a statistic to Johann, a reality. Men he knew, men he had worked alongside for years, standing in the streets in the particular posture of men who have nowhere to be. Germany had had 4 chancellors in the previous 12 months. The government changed so often that it had stopped feeling like government at all. It felt like chaos wearing a suit. And then there was the voice on the radio. Johann had not voted for Hitler, not in 1932. He had voted for the Social Democrats the way he always had, the way his father had, the way men at his factory largely did. He was not a Nazi. He did not attend rallies. He found something about Hitler's manner, the intensity, the grandiosity, faintly embarrassing, the way a reasonable man finds embarrassing the person at a party who speaks too loudly about things that are more complicated than they are pretending. But he had listened, and what he had heard, underneath the embarrassing parts, was something that spoke directly to the specific texture of his exhaustion. Order, work, a country that functions. He nodded at his lathe and waited to see what happened next. What happened next, over the following months, was a systematic dismantling of the legal and institutional structures that had existed in Germany since 1919. It happened faster than most people thought possible. A Reichstag fire in February 1933, the Parliament building burning under circumstances that were never fully explained, gave Hitler the pretext he needed. Within a week, emergency decrees suspended civil liberties, the right to free speech, the right to assembly, the right to a fair trial. Gone, legally, by emergency order. A month later, the Enabling Act passed the Reichstag with the required two-thirds majority. It gave Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. The parliament had voted, more or less freely, to make itself irrelevant. The Social Democrats were the only party to vote against it. Johann's party. He learned about the vote from a colleague at the factory, a man named Ernst, who had always been more politically engaged than Johann, who collected newspapers and argued about policy over the lunch break. Ernst told him what had happened with the particular expression of a man who had expected bad news and received it exactly as bad as expected. Johann went home that evening and told Margareta. She asked what it meant. He said he wasn't sure yet. That answer, that honest, careful, uncertain answer, would be the last time for a long time that Johann Winkler said something true about politics inside his own home. By the summer of 1933, the transformation was largely complete. All political parties except the Nazi Party had been dissolved or had dissolved themselves. Trade unions had been abolished. The press was coordinated, gleichgeschaltet, they called it, the word that means brought into line, synchronized, made to move together. Newspapers that had disagreed with the government for decades now agreed. Columnists who had been skeptics were either silent or had become enthusiastic. It happened with a speed that many ordinary Germans found both alarming and, in a strange way, relieving. The uncertainty was over. The chaos had been replaced by something that at least had a shape. Johann noticed the changes the way you notice changes when they happen gradually, and then all at once. Like the factory floor rearranged overnight. Everything slightly different, nothing where you expected it, but the work continues because the work always continues. He noticed that Ernst stopped bringing newspapers to the lunch break. He noticed that the foreman, a blunt man named Haas, who had always called things as he saw them, started calling things slightly differently. Not dishonestly exactly, just carefully, choosing words that couldn't be misread. He noticed that his neighbor in the apartment building, a Jewish man named David Rosenthal, who sold fabrics from a small shop on the ground floor, had put a sign in his window. Not a sign he had chosen to put there. A sign that had been put there for him by people who came in the night. Johann walked past it in the morning on his way to the factory. He walked past it faster than usual. He did not go in to ask how Rosenthal was doing, the way he sometimes had. He told himself he would another time. Hilda was 15 in 1933, old enough to have opinions, young enough to form them almost entirely from the environment around her. She joined the League of German Girls, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, in the spring, the way most of her classmates joined. There was social pressure of the particular teenage variety, the kind that doesn't announce itself as pressure, but that nobody in the middle of it can resist. You joined because your friends joined. You joined because the teacher mentioned it warmly. You joined because not joining required an explanation that a 15-year-old girl didn't have the words to give. She came home that first evening with a uniform and a different quality of energy than she'd had before. More certain, more directed. Margaret looked at the uniform for a moment. Then she said it looked nice. Johann said nothing. After Hildy went to bed, Margaret sat with him at the kitchen table. She said she's going to come home with ideas. Johann said, most of them will probably be harmless. Margaret said, and the others? Johann had no answer. He made himself a promise that night. If it came to something real, something that crossed a real line, he would speak. He was not a coward. He had been in a war. He knew what real lines looked like. He just wasn't sure, yet, exactly where this one was. The real line moved. That is the thing he had not accounted for. Not that there was no line, but that the line was not fixed. It shifted, incrementally, by degrees so small that the shift itself was nearly invisible from inside it. In 1933, the line was the sign in Rosenthal's window. Johann walked past it. In 1934, the line was Rosenthal closing his shop. He had not closed it voluntarily. A series of regulations had made it effectively impossible for Jewish businesses to operate normally. Rosenthal moved in with his brother's family in Frankfurt. Johann helped him carry 2 boxes to the truck that came for his furniture. They shook hands at the door. Rosenthal thanked him. Johann said he was sorry. He meant it. It was the last thing he said about it for a long time. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were announced. They stripped Jewish citizens of German citizenship. Marriages between Jews and non-Jews were criminalized. Johann heard the announcement on the radio. He turned the volume down slightly, not off, just lower. Hildy was at a meeting that evening. Margaret was mending something. The apartment was quiet. He sat with the quiet for a while. And then he went to bed. Because what was the alternative? He was one man. He had a wife and a daughter and a job and an apartment and a life that still, in its physical details, resembled a life. He was not a political person. He was a machinist. He told himself, I am not doing this. I am only not stopping it. Those are different things. He told himself that for years. Hilda was 17 when she first said something at dinner that made Johann set down his fork. It was about the Jews. Not violent, not the way things would later become violent. Just something she had heard at a meeting, repeated with the easy certainty of a person who had been given an explanation for a complicated world and found it satisfying. Johann looked at her. Margaret looked at her plate. Hildy waited for a response. Johann picked up his fork and said, That's a complicated subject. Hilda said, It doesn't seem complicated to me. He nodded slowly, changed the subject. Afterward, when Hilda had gone to her room, Margaret said nothing. She washed the dishes. Johann dried them. The apartment was quiet. He had not contradicted his daughter. He had not agreed with her. He had changed the subject, which was a thing he had been doing for years with increasing frequency, and which had become so habitual that it no longer felt like a decision. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made 1,000 small calculations, each of them individually reasonable, each of them tipping him slightly further in a direction he had not chosen and could not quite name. That is the most difficult truth about what happened in Germany. It was not built by monsters. It was built by calculations. November 9th, 1938. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Johann was woken at 3 a.m. by sound, glass breaking, somewhere not far away. A sound that, even half asleep, registered as wrong in a way that other nighttime sounds did not. He went to the window. Down the street, a synagogue was burning. Men were standing watching it, some of them laughing, some of them just watching the way people watch fires. He stood at his window for a long time. Margaret came to stand beside him. She made a sound that was not quite a word. Johann said nothing. He did not go outside. He did not call anyone. He pulled the curtain closed and went back to the bedroom and lay on the bed in the dark and did not sleep. In the morning he walked to the factory, past broken glass on the sidewalk. Shop windows caved in, a smell of burning still in the air. He did not look at the men he passed. He sat at his lathe and ran his machine. He did not speak about what he had seen. For the first time in his life, Johann Winkler was genuinely afraid. Not of the regime, not abstractly. Afraid of himself, of what it meant that he had watched that fire from his window and done nothing, of what that made him. He went home that evening and sat at the dinner table with Margaret and Hilda and ate his meal and said nothing. And in the silence at that table, something was decided. Not stated, not agreed to, just settled into, the way water settles into the shape of whatever contains it. The family would survive. That was the priority. Everything else was secondary. It was not a cowardly decision. It was not a courageous one. It was the decision that millions of ordinary Germans made in the months and years that followed, each of them with their own version of Johann's calculation, each of them with their own version of his silence. And out of those millions of silences, history was made. Johann Winkler survived the war. He was too old for active combat, called up only in the desperate final months, assigned to a home defense unit that never fired a shot before the surrender came. He was alive on May 8, 1945, when the war ended. He sat in his apartment, the same apartment, the curtains he had closed on the night of Kristallnacht still hanging in the same window, and listened to the announcement on the radio. Germany had surrendered, the war was over, the regime was finished. He sat very still for a long time. Margaret came and sat beside him. She took his hand. Neither of them spoke. Hilda was 27 by then. She had married a man who had died in Russia in 1943. She had a daughter of her own, 2 years old, named for no one in particular, just a name that sounded like a beginning. In the weeks that followed, the denazification process began. Forms to fill out, questions to answer. Which organizations had you belonged to? Which events had you attended? What had you done? Johann filled out his forms honestly. He had belonged to no party, attended no rallies, done nothing on paper that required explanation. His form was processed. He was categorized as a follower, Mitläufer, someone who had gone along, not a perpetrator, not a resistor, just a man who had walked past a sign in a window, who had turned down a radio, who had changed the subject at dinner, who had closed a curtain. He received his clearance certificate and went back to work at the metalworks. He never spoke about the war with his daughter, never spoke about it with his wife, never spoke about Rosenthal, who did not return from Frankfurt, who had been deported in 1942 and had not survived. He knew this. He learned it from a neighbor who had heard from someone else. He put it away in the place where he put things he could not hold. There is a question that historians and philosophers and ordinary people have argued about since 1945. How did it happen? Not the mechanics of it, not the laws passed and the armies raised and the camps built. Those are documented in extraordinary, terrible detail. The question is the human one. How did millions of ordinary people like Johann, people with families and jobs and ordinary human decency, allow it? Some were enthusiasts. Some were ideological believers who wanted what Hitler promised and did not think too carefully about the price. But most were not. Most were people doing the calculation. Risk versus survival. My family versus strangers. The world I can affect versus the world I cannot. They were not wrong that the risk was real. People who resisted openly were arrested, sent to camps, killed. The danger was not imaginary. The calculation was not irrational. But the calculation made by enough people made the whole thing possible. This is the truth that is hardest to sit with. Not that there were monsters, but that there were people. People who woke up early and went to work and ate dinner with their families and told themselves each time they walked past something they should not have walked past that they were only not stopping it, which is different from doing it. Johann Winkler died in 1971 in the same apartment he had lived in since 1928. He had grandchildren by then. He was a grandfather who taught his grandchildren to play cards and walked with them in the park, and was, by all accounts, a gentle and attentive man. He never talked about the war. His granddaughter, who became a historian, which is one of those facts that feels almost too pointed to be true, asked him once, when she was in university, what it had been like. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We didn't know." She waited. He said, "We didn't know everything." And she, who had spent years studying what her grandfather's generation had and had not known, understood that both of those sentences were true, and that the space between them was the whole story. The Germany of 1933 was not a country of monsters. It was a country of people. People who were tired and frightened and economically desperate, and who chose, most of them, the same thing that people in desperate circumstances have always chosen. They chose to survive. And in choosing to survive, in closing the curtains, in changing the subject, in walking a little faster past the sign in the window, they made possible the thing they were surviving. That is not a comfortable thought. It is not meant to be. Because the question it leaves behind, the one that does not go away after the facts are learned and the histories are read and the documentaries are watched, is the personal one. The one you have to ask about yourself. Not what would you have done. You cannot know that. But this, what are the small calculations you are already making? The things you walk past a little faster. The subjects you change at dinner. The curtains you close. History does not announce itself. It is built from ordinary mornings, one nod at a time.